Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed here today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Johanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Dr. Emily Wakild. Dr. Wakild is a professor of environmental studies and the Cecil D. Andrus Endowed Chair for the Environment and Public Lands at Boise State University. Raised in Eastern Oregon, she earned her BA from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon in 1999 and her PhD from the University of Arizona in 2007. Dr. Wakild's main academic research excavates documents, images, interviews, and fragments of the past to explain why and how large spaces for nature conservation were built throughout the Americas. She is the author of Revolutionary Parks, Conservation, Social Justice, and Mexico's National Parks, which received awards from the Conference of Latin American History, the Forest History Society, and the Southeastern Council on Latin American Studies. She has also written extensively about environmental pedagogy, including with Michelle K. Berry, A Primer for Teaching Environmental History, and the article Pedagogy for the Depressed, Empowerment and Hope in the Face of the Apocalypse in the Routledge Handbook of Environmental History. In 2024, her study of national parks in South America will be published. Her research has been supported by the Fulbright Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Wakild is currently working on several Idaho-based research projects, including essays on mispronouncing Idaho and work celebrating the ways conservation brings Idahoans together. Dr. Wakild is also a scholar for our Inquiring Idaho program, and she is available as a speaker at no charge. For information, visit idahohumanities.org. Dr. Wakild, thank you for joining me today to talk about our former beloved governor, Cecil Andrus.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here having this conversation with you.
Thank you. Cecil Andrus was a beloved figure from Idaho. Many new Idahoans probably are not familiar with his history and legacy. Can you start by telling us about his early years, where he grew up?
Absolutely. So Cease, as his friends called him, was an unlikely environmentalist. In fact, he began his career as a logger, and he was also an import into Idaho, like many of our best folks are, right? He grew up in Eugene and later Corvallis, Oregon, and married his high school sweetheart, Carol. When he graduated from high school, they got married. She was a sophomore becoming a junior, and she actually had to stop going to high school. She had to go to night school to finish because married students weren't allowed to attend high school. But they've been together. They were together the rest of his life, and he joined the Navy. After they got married, he enrolled in engineering at Oregon State, and then he joined the Navy and actually flew planes for the Navy during the Korean War, and went overseas, traveled around to several different stations across the U.S., and his first daughter, Tana, was born very small, 3 pounds, 12 ounces, and was on an incubator for the first bit of her life. And that really shaped him and his marriage, and I think some of his decisions about family. So he served his 4 years in the Navy. And at that point, he had a wife and a daughter and kind of needed a job. And his father had been a lumberman and had been involved in logging in Oregon. And his father had been asked to build a sawmill by a Spokane company that would be located in Orofino, Idaho. And so Cease came home with a plan for this job. His dad had offered him a really good job helping with that lumber mill. And by the time they moved up to Orofino, Carol was pregnant with Tracy, their second of 3 daughters. And so they really started their life there and became Idahoans right at the start of their young family. And so he was shaped by the timber industry, really kind of the natural resources resource economy that was Oregon and Idaho at that point.
How did he get involved in politics?
So this is a pretty interesting question, kind of accidentally, as some of our best politicians do, but there seem to have been two really important things that shaped his entrance into politics. And the first was that Carol and Cease were involved in everything in the small town of Orofino. They were co-presidents of the parent-teacher organization for the school, and Cease was president of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, which was the largest in the state. They served on the church council, and they ran a bowling league, and they went square dancing, and they really just loved being part of the community and were important leaders in those civil society sectors. And so they were noticeable and had lots of friends and connections that way. And they also were represented by a local Republican legislator who had some pretty outlandish ideas about education. So, for example, he suggested that the schools should be built underground, kind of as bunkers, so that the school district didn't have to pay for heat or air conditioning. Cease, who was an avid outdoorsman, thought that was absolutely absurd. Why would you deny students sunshine just to save a few bucks? And so he became inspired to run against this legislator and put his hat in the ring for state legislature and won because of the school situation and his prior leadership there. However, he was also inspired by a primary speech by John F. Kennedy that was given in 1960 or 1961 in Lewiston. And here was this young, charismatic, Democratic speaker who planted a seed in Cease, like JFK did in so many of that generation of people who wanted to give back and make their community stronger and better by sharing their talents with other people. And so the conjunction of those two things sort of ended up in him taking a political role. And once he won, he kept winning and he didn't look back.
Getting into politics must have been challenging for his really young family. I know you've had the opportunity to interview his three daughters and his widow. What was their perspective and what were their memories of that time?
Yeah, so I am so lucky to have been in the position to conduct about a dozen oral history interviews with the Andrus women over the past year, which have been amazing conversations, and they'll be archived and available as transcripts and recordings in the special collections of the Boise State Library, probably by this summer. And through those conversations, I really came to understand the perspective of the family and the ways that being a politician's wife or daughter was really challenging in the 1960s and 70s in just sort of the practice of daily life. So in addition to sort of what we would expect, which is being part of the media spotlight and being in the public sphere, and this was a time where their telephone numbers were listed in the phone book, so anybody could just sort of call up and rant, and people did. But there were really I think really interesting and poignant examples that the women shared about how the logistics of life didn't match with of political life didn't match with having a family. So, for example, you can think about the Idaho legislature that serves a spring term each year. Well, what does that mean for kids that are in school? Right? They either stay home in rural Idaho apart from their politician parent, or they travel and they disrupt their school life by moving down to Boise for that period of time. And that's what the Andrus women did. But to drive from Orofino down to Boise with a family in the 1960s, I mean, you can think about Highway 55 today and it being a challenge in all kinds of weather. And then think about what it must have been like to navigate that road with really small children in the 1960s. And that's what Carol did. And Cease, right? But he was more traveling with the state or on the campaign trail. And, Carol took really amazing care of the family, and those logistics were challenging to get them situated in schools. And the girls are 5 years apart. each. And so the challenges of having different stages of development and accounting for those pieces, I think were really challenging at different times and at different political junctures in coordination with his career. But you get such a sense for the tightness of the family and the real closeness that developed and the kinds of routines that they had and the really important special moments that they shared together and the ways that those really kept the core together and really strong, and how much that ability of Carol to take care of the family allowed Cease to take care of the state, and that relationship and that sort of strength and respect that they had for each other, and how much of an investment of time and care that was. And then you add to that the health challenges that many of the Andrus family had. So Tana, the oldest girl, was diagnosed with lupus. And shortly thereafter, when I think she was in her early 20s. And then Tracy Andrus had a form of Hodgkin's lymphoma when she was 19, which at that point was almost always a fatal diagnosis. And figuring out the health challenges and how to deal with those and what decisions to make was a family affair. That wasn't something that they were sort of publicly outward facing, but it was a very, very important piece of how not just they grew tighter as a family, but they cared for each other, and they made the space to be part of their lives for the entirety of their lives because of those commitments that they shared. And so much of that was the love of an adoring father and the really tightness of those relationships.
Well, that's really fascinating to hear, because you can imagine that the stress and the kind of wear and tear of travel, what that would mean for their family. And it's amazing to hear that they were all making sacrifices and all really serving the people of Idaho as a family.
Yeah, and that's such a good way of putting it. And it wasn't all, heartbreak and tragedy. There are some really funny stories and great newspaper headlines of, Tracy Andrus attending Boise High School and the governor's house getting toilet papered by the football team. And so the glory that must have been to take the toilet paper out for your friend Tracy, who just happened to be the governor's daughter, and points on the campaign trail where the girls wanted to wear a bikini in the hotel, and Cecil was like, oh, we're not having that picture on the trail. And just the real sort of human side of what it must have been like to grow up, not just in the spotlight, but in a family that was deeply private, but in a really public role, in a really public position.
Cecil Andrus served in the state legislature and then ran for governor. He lost the first race, but in 1970 he was elected governor, largely because he was opposed to extractive mining in the White Cloud Mountains. Can you tell us about that election and how those issues played a role?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is important to note that Cease ran for governor and fell short his first time. And he learned a lot from that campaign, and also the sort of serendipity of the late 1960s. His initial campaign was as an advocate for a new sales tax. Turns out Idahoans are huge fans of a new
Things
tax as a
don't
platform.
change, do
Yeah,
they?
right? But by 1970, he didn't think of himself as a conservationist, but came to see how a conservation platform was necessary to get elected and aligned with the values that most Idahoans held, and to many tellings that really still hold, right? And so in 1970, his election as governor made history for all kinds of reasons. He was 39 years old old when he was elected. And he campaigned for better schools, for an Idaho quality of life, and all the things that he represented largely that meant, right? Recreation in the out of doors and respect for different people and perspectives. But the upset victory came really on the grounds of protecting the White Clouds from a molybdenum mine that had been proposed by an out-of-state company. And that was an issue that wasn't on the radar when the campaign started, but in large part because of the work of a local reporter, Rob Brady, and Ernie Day's photographs that got the mining featured in Life magazine. This was a part of the campaign that really became larger than life. And Andrus is able to pull an upset victory over an incumbent governor with more than 52% of the vote. And then when he ran for re-election 4 years later, he was re-elected with more than 71% of the vote, which is the highest percentage of re-election in Idaho history, still is, right? And so a big part of that was his conservation record and his conservation legacy. And so he'd done a little work in the late 1960s and led a bill that prohibited dredge mining on the Middle Fork of the Salmon that has still held. But Castle Peak and the debate over Castle Peak so clearly highlighted the issues of sort of in-state versus out-of-state, the issue of mining versus other environmental uses, and the lack of urgency for what would have been creating this enormous open pit mine, 7 miles wide, 3 miles deep, that would have completely destroyed the viewshed of this peak that many Idahoans knew and loved. And so the conjunction of those issues and then the press it received really resulted in, and the polling, there's really good polling that showed that Idahoans cared about that peak. And then Cease called it Castle Peak was the peak that made a governor. And it really did. And there's a really neat harmony between the meadow that's there today, which is that would have been the open pit mine, but the meadow that changes and is ephemeral, but it rotates through with the seasons and returns every year, and the peak that's eternal and not changing and really sort of permanent on that horizon. And it's worth noting that Idaho representative today, Mike Simpson, has a picture of that peak in his office, really, because it's such a piece that's really in the heart of a lot of what Idaho's political history stands for.
It's almost impossible to overstate the impact Governor Andrus had. I don't think we can imagine our beautiful Idaho without the White Clouds, without Castle Peak, and without the Sawtooth Wilderness area. Governor Andrus played a key role in creating that area as well.
Yeah, if you think about all the wilderness that exists in Idaho, which by many reports has more wilderness than any state besides Alaska, right? Depending on the time you're looking and whatever. And Alaska, most of which can also be credited to Governor Andrus's role as Secretary of the Interior. But if you think about Idaho's wilderness footprint, almost every single acre that was federally protected before the Owyhee Initiative of 2009 had Cecil Andrus and Frank Church's fingerprints on it. Right. And sometimes they were in a different role. Frank was almost always in the congressional place, so moving the bills forward and making that happen. But so many of them had other support from Cease behind there. So if it was him in an office lying maps on a floor and saying this parcel but not this parcel, or that piece but not this one, or it was the relationships that he had and built and stewarded over time with Republicans. So Jim McClure was in the Idaho Senate, a senator from Payette, right, that has also had an important impact on our state. And they were junior senators the same year. And so McClure served a federal senator when Cecil Andrus was in the secretary's office, and Cease knew he had someone he could call on to be on the other side of the aisle and to help him out with particular things. They didn't always see eye to eye, just like him and Frank Church didn't always see eye to eye, but the things they were able to accomplish by compromising and working with each other on especially those land bills have left Idaho the way it is today. And as important as the pieces they put into place that are there, like the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and the River of No Return and Hell's Canyon, are the things that aren't there. And I think that's also really interesting to think about when we think about the Idaho legacies of conservation. So for example, there's not development in the Sawtooth Valley like Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for example, right? It isn't overdeveloped. It doesn't have ranchettes and suburbs. And so the land use planning and the restrictions on development were an important piece of that scenic part, but it's also not a national park. Right. And other than a little sliver of Yellowstone and some national monuments, the National Park Service has very little of a footprint in Idaho, despite, as Idahoans, what we know to be some of the most beautiful and wild and amazing places in the US. And that's not accidental. And so that's another piece that I think is really interesting, that if it was a national park, more people would come. More people would know about it. And it was never the fame, it was never the impressing outsiders that motivated Cease's environmental work or his wilderness work either. And those are interesting polarities that I think are fun to think about.
You mentioned that Cease got into politics because of his interest in education. He is also the leader that brought kindergarten to Idaho. Can you talk more about his views on education and why it was so important to him?
Because of his three daughters, right? He saw firsthand that his girls weren't getting what they needed and the attention they needed in rural Idaho. And he made a commitment to change that and to invest state dollars in in especially early childhood education, but also in keeping Idaho's best and brightest in Idaho. And so interestingly enough, he brought kindergarten to Idaho and approved it as a governor, but he also, in his post-gubernatorial legacy years, worked really hard to make sure that there was a fellowship that kept Idaho students at Idaho higher education universities and made sure that they were able to compete with external universities and to keep those students in Idaho and giving back to Idaho. He also, it was under Cecil Andrus that Boise State College became Boise State University in 1974. And so he signed that paperwork and made it the third university level with the University of Idaho and Idaho State University. And he also was instrumental in bringing the engineering school to Boise State as well and to expanding the role of engineering there. So he's been a champion of higher education, even though he never finished his college degree, right? He left Oregon State and served in the military and became a, but he did not ever graduate from college, which is not untypical from his generation, but he was deeply committed to making Idaho attractive for businesses. And he saw higher education as an essential piece of being able to do that, and helped Hewlett-Packard see that in the 1970s and then encouraged the Micron expansion in the 1980s too. And to a big degree, we're still reaping the benefits of that support of higher education for the growth of our state.
For sure. In 1977, he was asked to serve as the Secretary for the Interior under President Jimmy Carter. Why was he selected?
Yeah, this is a great question. Traditionally, the Secretary of the Interior, and the Interior being the Ministry of everything, right? Everything else that has the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Land Management and the Park Service and so many other important pieces to it. Traditionally, the Secretary role has been a Westerner. And many presidents have seen the need for that role in particular to go to someone because so much of the West is federal public land. And so matching a Western sensibility with the need for a federal presence to represented in Washington in that way has been a good move for many, many presidents. And we can sort of see this footprint all over the West, right? The Udalls in Arizona and Salazar in Colorado and lots of places where this is the case. And Andrus was very much true. And you can see it. So he served as the 44th secretary, and you can see that kind of through line of Westerners up through Sally Jewell and Deb Haaland as well. But his role as a governor was also as important. So it helped that he was a Westerner. It was also important that he'd met Jimmy Carter when Jimmy Carter was also a governor. And so the governor's events and the sort of circuit of governors was really meaningful for building networks and political coalitions in Cecil's time. And that was true for the family as well. And so he'd met Jimmy, and he also knew what it would sort of be like to work on Western issues within that context. And so it was a decision that I think was difficult given the timing for the family, with the Tracy and Tana both being not in great health at that time. But the whole family went back to serve Carter. And there's an amazing journey that took place because Jimmy Carter won the election, Cecil got the call, and he was on a plane and in DC the next day. Well, the women had to pack everything up and move. And so they drove their 3 cars from Idaho to DC
Oh,
together.
wow.
And, this is before cell phones, before digital maps, before any of that. And what an adventure they had to get there and then to support him in that role.
During his time in Washington, he helped reduce the impact of mining in Appalachia, protected rivers in California, and helped to set aside more than 100 million acres in Alaska, as you mentioned, for federal protection. How was he able to get so much done to successfully negotiate with all of the environmental groups, Congress, and everyone else who's involved in that process?
Yeah, they were amazing conjunctions of time and personality that I think help explain that. And certainly the 1970s were the environmental revolutionary days, right? We can thank the politicians of the 1970s, including Richard Nixon, right, who passed more environmental laws than any president, right, for the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the National Environmental Policy Act that requires that decisions be made transparently about the environmental impact of big infrastructure projects. And so riding on the Endangered Species Act of 73, and so riding on the crest of this major transformation in US legislation that was almost always unanimously passed, right? So think of Congress today and imagine a time.
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, and the progress that was made in the early and even towards the later 70s was tremendous. It was just a sea change in designations and transformed the world as we know it. And it's easy to forget that happened 50 years ago, and we're still reaping the benefits. And not a lot has happened policy-wise of that revolutionary nature since. And so Jimmy Carter and Cecil Andrus were very much a big part of that, especially when it came down to federal protection of lands. And so by almost any estimation, that duo has protected more land than any other configuration, except possibly Teddy Roosevelt, because of Alaska, right? And because of the size and scale of Alaska, like you mentioned. But I think so some of that was the timing and the ability and the consciousness of both the social movements of the 1960s and then the environmental movements and their legacies of the 1970s. But the other piece was that Cecil Andrus was a really wise governor. And 3 of his 4 terms, the Republicans were in control of the lawmaking part of the state. And so he had to ride the middle, and he did that really well. He knew how to get things done. He knew the layout of how politics worked, and he knew people. He knew how to remember people's names and what they liked and have honest and frank and authentic conversations, whether it was in a grocery store or on a campaign trail or behind closed doors, trying to get his colleagues to move on a particular issue. And so he could negotiate because he had that skill, but he also didn't love to talk about himself. He deflected a lot, and he didn't always have to get credit. And there's so much that can get done if you're not worried about whose name goes on the bill, right? Or who it's named after. And he was willing to set that ego aside and to set that credit piece aside in order to accomplish really enormous things for our state and our country.
What a model that is for what could be accomplished today if politicians set ego aside and work together. I hope we'll see that more.
Yes. Me
When
too.
he, yeah, when he returned to Idaho, he surprised many people by running for governor again. Why did he want to be governor again?
Because he had started so young, he had so much more still to do. And I think his love of Idaho and his knowledge that he could do things, right, and sort of fly in the face of the stereotypes of Idaho and sort of the West. I think he had a network of people that supported him and respected him. And I think he had a lot more he wanted to do. There were more things, more rivers to protect, more designations to get on the books, and a lot more social policy also to get the infrastructure and architecture built for. So I think he saw more diversity within the two parties than we see today. And so there was a clearer middle road that he could walk. And I think the opportunity to do that, because of the team that had supported him for so long, really was behind him in doing that.
He had no trouble being reelected governor, and in his next term, he worked really hard to oppose federal efforts to store nuclear waste in Idaho. This was a big fight. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah. So because he's this interesting personality that walked both the federal representation, right, as Secretary of the Interior, and then was state legislature and governor, he really saw states' rights from both sides. But as a lower D Democrat, really wanted what was best for the communities he fit within, and for Idaho. And the nuclear waste issue was one that he could not see a reason to accept that for within the state. It wasn't waste produced by Idaho. It wasn't waste that should be stored here, and it didn't belong here. And he didn't want to sort of cave on that conversation. And so the strategy behind, he had a keen sense of public relations and sort of media. And the way his daughters tell this story is that he called up the Idaho State Police and said, "Give me your biggest, buffest, burliest state police officer and have him go park his trooper car on the railroad where that waste would be coming in, and have him cross his arms and, show off his muscles and say, 'No way, that's not coming in our state.'" And so that's on the front page of the paper, right? This, not Governor Andrus saying no, but this Idaho state trooper saying, "We don't want your waste in our state." And the interesting piece of the nuclear waste opposition was how he kept paying that forward and how he renewed it, and in negotiating with Governor Batt after him, who kept that mantle up. And it remains one of the important legacies of both of those administrations.
I found it really interesting to learn that in 1990, Andrus vetoed a bill to make abortion illegal, except in cases of rape, incest, severe fetal deformity, or where the pregnancy posed a threat to the mother's life. Why did he veto this bill, and what were his beliefs about abortion?
Yeah, this is also another important legacy point of Andrus's, and how he made that decision, I think was pretty agonizing, because he was religious, was against abortion in his own thinking, but his daughter Tracy was an important voice in his ear for understanding the effects on women and on the decision-making women would be allowed to have if a law like that was passed. And so, here we are 35 years later, still, having conversations around the recent Supreme Court decisions. But the 90 bill in Idaho was the first attempt to try and have the states pass bills that limited the federal protection after Roe. And it was the most extreme. And so it was a really pivotal and important thing for Andrus to sort of uphold the federal piece of it by vetoing that. And he paid for it politically. I mean, there was certainly backlash against him and for doing that. But in a word, he did it because his daughter convinced him to. And not all of his family was on the same position. They didn't all agree with Tracy, but the veto of that bill, I think, sort of held the line on some of those cases for some time. And it's, I think, an interesting counterpoint to the kinds of effects that Idaho's feeling now for the changes. So the reduction of OBGYN doctors in Idaho as a result of this. And so I think Andrus would not have envisioned that, but he did see that it was a bill that wasn't taking care of the entirety of the population. And so he made that really, really hard call for himself.
It's fascinating to me that so many of the issues we've talked about today that Governor Andrus faced, we're still reckoning with them in Idaho today. Governor Andrus also called attention to dams in Idaho and the impact that the Snake River salmon species was experiencing because of dams. Can you tell us more about what he did back in the early 1990s?
Yeah, so Andrus was a classic sportsman. He went hunting every year. He loved to fish. His daughters told me that one of the first things that they learned was how to catch and gut a fish. Like, that was very much part of his ethic, right? And it was one that was really deeply entwined with the amazing habitat we have for salmon and trout and other fish within Idaho. And so those were environmental legacies that were important to him as a person. And he viewed the role of a politician as supporting some of those. And his sort of outdoor ethic is legendary. Reporters talk about meeting him for the first time while he was picking blueberries or walking in a stream, and just sort of came by that naturally. And in representing that sportsman ethic, he hosted a number of conversations around fish health and stream health. And some of the biggest obstacles to that are the hydroelectric system that was put in place that interrupts the journey, in particular, of some of the most far traveling and magical fish on Earth. And that was a moral conundrum that he didn't want to have escape, right? He didn't want development and infrastructure to compromise one of the most amazing migratory processes that, begins in the habitat of central Idaho. And so he slowly, but through his teams and his networks, hosted conversations about what that meant to Idaho's 5 tribes, what that meant to users of the rivers, irrigators, transportation, communities alongside those, and having those conversations really through the 90s and thinking about the whole spectrum of possibilities that exist, not to erase what has been done to the rivers, but to help mitigate and think about what a more resilient future could look like, not just for the fish, but for the communities that are adjoined to it. And so it was something he cared about deeply through his commitment and love of fishing, but it was also an important part of the Idaho legacy of having conversations about environmental issues, not just for their scenic components, but for the wide range of values that they can contribute to a larger society.
This is still an issue that Representative Simpson is working through and talking about. Despite his popularity, though, Governor Andrus, after 4 terms, chose not to run again. I'm curious why he made that decision and what he did after he left office.
Yeah, I think he had made a number of significant wins with legislation and from the governor's office. But I think he also sort of saw the opportunity to be a convener of those conversations. And he pivoted his role from being in the public sphere to running the Andrus Center for Public Policy, which I'm affiliated with now, which convened almost annually a conference to talk about a pressing social issue, often in partnership with the Idaho Statesman or the Frank Church Institute or Trout Unlimited, or lots of other different organizations, and a wide range of public conversations were hosted. So Clarine, his long-term receptionist and support, had a permanent job supporting that, and it was really important to him to give her a position, and he used the last pieces of his campaign coffers to set that up, and it's still going strong nearly 25 years later. And those conferences really were based on this idea that you could get 150 people in the room that were professionals, that were experienced, and have agencies collect and share data and talk to each other and sort of make something happen. And so the Snake River between us was one of those, related to what we were just talking about. Public lands values was another one. There were some important conversations about Social Security and national security right after 9/11 that were held. And really, he took his professional gravitas into a more academic setting and a more professional setting to have these conferences and use the power of collaboration and convening these conversations in order to continue to move public issues forward.
He really was the last Democratic governor of Idaho. Later in his life, he lamented that increasing partisanship in Idaho and in the nation. What lessons do you think we can learn from his legacy of working in the middle, as he described himself?
It's such a more pleasant place to be. I mean, I think that he really did enjoy some of the parts of the bureaucratic apparatus that get under-recognized. So, for example, in the 1970s, Idaho's first local land use planning act was signed into law with him. And land use planning is an important piece of, how we have the foothills available in Boise and how other parts of the state have been able to control what gets sited close to them. He also made sure that a 500 megawatt coal plant that was slotted to be built between Mountain Home and Boise didn't happen. And imagine our air quality if that had been constructed. And so he planted the seed for geothermal heat to be used in the Capitol building in the 1970s. And that's an important part of Boise's choices. And same thing for preventing another dam above Lucky Peak. So, he improved the health of the river, he improved the health of the air, he improved the health of the land by some of these sort of boring, middle of the road, but easily compromised on. These are not like clickbait soundbite sort of things. They're really just issues Idahoans cared about, and he was able to make compromises around them. And I think that there's a tremendous lesson for reasonable people that would like to do the kind of stewardship and care that he was able to as a politician, that a more reasonable path certainly exists. And I hope there's hope to think about what actions towards that might look like going forward.
One of my favorite things about Idaho is that people on the right and people on the left come together because of the beauty of our wilderness and our land here. We all care about it, and I hope that is one of the legacies of Governor Andrus that will continue into the future.
Absolutely. I think that's really well said, Johanna. And I think his leadership, his commitment to education, and his ability to see environmental issues from all sides and be compromising and reasonable, but still supportive of them, was really legendary.
Absolutely. I've heard a few stories, meeting people who worked with Governor Andrus and knew him, of Cease showing up early to a meeting and introducing himself as Cease and just excited to be here, and no ego, no barriers to the work and getting it done. What a legacy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And real person, which is a big part of it. Friendly and fun and engaging. Absolutely.
Dr. Wakild, thank you so much for being here today. It's wonderful. You and I joked that we were looking forward to sprinkling some cease around Idaho, and I think we've done that today.
Let's hope they get lots of water and we see the flowers soon. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.